What I'm going to show you is import of buildings, roads, railways, address points, and the agglomeration boundary as a div area. Here it's shown in the blue as a boundary of the agglomeration. Then I'm going to select the buildings within the div area with a residential function. And I'm going to show you how that works. And then, for these selected buildings, I'm going to create the receivers at facades, because you only need to create receivers around buildings that has a function of residential. So these are the 3 steps I'm going to do now. Import, then select the buildings within the div area. Then I'm going to create the receivers at the facades. So I'm going to switch over to Predictor. First, I'm going to create a new model in Predictor. I'm going to select the Lima CNOSSOS EU method. Say OK. I've given it the name Initial Model. With the info button, you can always name it differently. In this case, it's the RNM hoops. Then I'm going to open the model. Okay, this is of course where we start. We have nothing. Then with the File Import option, you can select what type of file you're going to import. In this case, we're going to import shape files. I select shape. Then going to the data folder where I've stored my shape files. And first I'm going to select the buildings. So I select the shapefile buildings.shp, click on open. Then I need to select which type of item I want to create out of this shapefile. This is of course building. Then Predictor shows the fields that a building item needs. So a building item has an ident, a description, a height, a designated use, building type, profile correction, and reflection factors per octave. These are the file fields offered by the shapefile. In this case, they are identical. And that's of course very nice because then I don't have to select. However, if these few file fields are named differently, then you can always select with this small button, select a different field in the shapefile that you want to connect to the item field in the predictor item. But in this case, I do not need to change my selection because they are all the same. So I click on OK. Predictor is now importing the buildings. It's saving the changes. And here's beneath is the message section, and it says imported 51,000 buildings from this shapefile. Okay, I'm going to go to the display options and select the default coloring for buildings because I had selected a thematic coloring. Okay, so here you see the buildings. If I double click on the building, you see that it has a height, 12.16 meters. And it also has some properties like the designated use. This is a residential function, and also the building type. It's apartments with a single facade. I'll come back on this later. I'll zoom out again. So next, we're going to import the road structure. So I click on the road shapefile. And again, I need to select what type of item I want to create. I want to create a road item. Again, you see the fields needed in Predictor and the fields offered by the file. In this case, they've got the same name, so that's easy. Click on OK. So here you see the roads imported in Predictor. I do the same import for the railways. Click on railways, open. And of course, I need to create a railway item. Again, the item fields and the file fields. Yes, in this case, there's one railway. That's this one. This is a railway in Arnhem. It's going to through the center of the city. Okay, and then I'm going to import the address points. I click on address point. And of course, we want to create address points. Click on OK. Address points are locations that should be inside buildings or in the building footprint. And an address point tells us how many people and how many dwellings are located inside the building. For instance, here we see a building with one address point, and oops, and this says that it's only one people and one dwelling. Well, not that much. When there are, for instance, this is a building here with information. Oh, sorry, that's a building, but I needed to click on the address point. Yep, address point, location, 4 people, 1 dwelling in this building. If there are multiple address points inside a building, then they are summed up. So then all the dwellings are and people are assigned to that building. Okay, zooming out again. Next, we're going to import the boundary, and that's a div area. Select the div area, and the div area presents the agglomeration boundary. This is of course an example, but you will see that it's very convenient to have the agglomeration boundary as an item in your predictor model. Like I explained, a div item does not influence the calculation, but it's very useful. Next, we're going to create the receivers around those buildings with the function residential. This means that I first I'm going to use the display option helping me to select those type of buildings. Okay, first I'm going to hide all the items. Then I'm going to select the agglomeration boundary. Then I double click on the building item type, and I'm going to use a thematic presentation. And I can make a thematic presentation based on the function of the item. And then I can create a text comparison with equal, contains, start with, end with. But in this case, I only want to see those buildings with this color that has a function that equals residential, so the text residential. And all the other items I want to draw in the standard color settings. So I say OK. Then you see at the right hand side in the display options, you automatically see that there's a thematic presentation. And now I also have to activate the building item for display. So what you see now is the buildings are colored in 2 ways. This is a building with a function residential, and this is a building not with a function residential. Okay, I zoom out again. Now I only want to display those buildings with the function that equals residential. So I deselect the other buildings. So now I only see the buildings with the function residential. And next I want to select only those buildings inside my agglomeration boundary. So I click on my agglomeration boundary, my div area, use my right mouse click button, come in the mouse menu, and then I say select with polygon all items inside this selected polygon. So now all buildings inside my agglomeration boundary are selected. And I know that all these buildings have a function equals residential. So now I can create my facade, my receivers around the facades. I go to the edit option, say batch create items, and I select receivers at facades. Then I come in this option where I can select a receiver height. Well, of course, for the EU noise maps, they need to be 4 meters height. The distance to the facade, predictor recommends 10 centimeters in front of the facade. You can also do a minimum building height. Well, of course, they need to be at least 4 meters height. Otherwise, if they are lower, then your building, your receiver height of 4 meters will be higher than the building. So a minimum building height of 4 meters. In many cases I use 5, but there's some question about it. And then you need to select what type of method you're going to use for creating the receivers around facades. The CNOSSOS describes, in fact, two methods, case 1 and case 2. And case 2, in fact, is divided into two sub-methods, case 2a and 2b. In this case, I'm going to select case 1. It's also not very clear in which case you have to select case 1 and in which case you have to select case 2, also not in the CNOSSOS method. So maybe there will be more information coming during this year. But I select create. So now Predictor is creating the receivers around the facades. And you see this is the progress form of creating the receivers around the facades. About 130,000 receivers. And then it will start saving the changes because it's now created in memory. It's now dumping it to the file, and that takes a couple of minutes. So I will switch over to my already prepared model after creating the receivers. And here the receivers are colored yellow. So here you see your complete model. Maybe I'm going to change the color of the receivers. I'm going to do the default coloring, and it's maybe more obvious. Okay. So over here you see all the receivers created around the facades. What you also see, I forgot to mention that, is that I've checked the option to add the length of the facade to the description. So every receiver in the description now also have the length of the represented facade in the description, and this will be used during the EU noise population option, EU population exposure option in Predictor, which I will going to show in part 4. So you see that a lot of things you can do in Predictor. You do not need to do that in a GIS system. Okay, switching back to my presentation. Coming back on the receivers at facade. I told you that CNOSSOS describes two cases. Case 1 is that the facades are split up in regular intervals on each facade. That means that segments of a length of more than 5 meters are split up into regular intervals of the longest possible length, but less than or equal than 5 meters. And the receivers are placed in the middle of each regular interval. So then you create this type of receivers around the facade. That's case 1. Then case 2 is that the facades are split up at a set distance from start of the polygon. For instance, every 5 meters. So that means that every 5 meters a receiver point will be created. That's another way of creating the receivers around the facade. And in fact, case 2 is divided into two cases, 2a and 2b, because it says that facades are considered separately or are split up every 5 meters. So within this case 2, in fact, there are two cases. That's why we call it 2a and 2b. And then I've shown you this dialog, create receivers at facades. I forgot to mention this checkbox, add facade length to the receiver description. And I've shown you in the description of a receiver that the length is added. And that's and that will be used in the EU population exposure option, which I'm going to explain in part 4. So a lot of things have been done already now. I'm going to go give you a sneak preview of part 4, because in part 4 I will go into more detail on the address points and of course the EU population exposure. But here you see that address points if they are within one building, they are summed up. And an address point means the number of people and the number of dwellings. So an address point should be inside a building. That's important to realize. So in your GIS files that you need to create before you're importing it in Predictor, you also have to have this address point file. And that needs to be most likely created in GIS. Or in some cases, countries have it available in this format. Then I also explained the building properties, two options, designated use and the building type. Designated use is of course important to select the residential buildings and not the commercial or industries. And the building type is important because the CNOSSOS method says that for single dwellings you need to have the maximum noise level around the facade. But for apartment buildings, there are two other methods of counting the number of dwellings and the number of people exposed to noise. So that's why the building type is also very important to have as an attribute in the building. I will explain more about that in part 4. And then my last sheet for today is this is the EU population exposure that I'm going to explain in part 4. Here you select what type of residential building use you're going to select, of course, a residential building use. And that selection is done on the building property, designated use. And then here you're going to select the type of building that is going to be used for the method 1, the most exposed facade, or the method 2, length of represented facade, or the method 3, the median value. And this is a new method that's added to the CNOSSOS method end of last year. That was in the amendment document. And these selections are done based on the building property building type. Okay, so coming back on the flow, what I've done, if I've imported the GIS files, I created the receivers as facades. Then next week, I'm going to show you how to tile the main model. Then do the calculation either locally or using the Predictor Lima Cloud calculation service, and then importing the tiles in the main model so that you've got your complete agglomeration, all the results in one main model. That is in part 3 next week. Then the week after, part 4, I'm going to explain the EU population exposure and the export to either Excel or GIS.